Hello and welcome to this video on how CO2 and by extension global warming promotes plant growth. One of the bigger counter-arguments for climate change, global warming, or whatever other phrase you prefer is that extra CO2 is good for plants and so they will grow bigger and better. In part, this comes from the fact that about half of the world's green regions have become more green over the last 35 years. This is evidently caused by rising CO2 and based on the process of plant growth. Green leaves use energy from sunlight through photosynthesis to chemically combine carbon dioxide drawn from the air with water and nutrients tapped from the ground to produce sugars. These are then the main source of food, fiber, and fuel for life on Earth. Studies have shown that increased concentrations of carbon dioxide increase photosynthesis. This increases plant growth. This is not the only factor, as nitrogen, the amount of land covered, climate change by way of global temperatures, precipitation, and sunlight all contribute to various growth. Using carbon dioxide as a form of fertilizer only explains 70% of the changing effect in green coverage. This is because photosynthesis is dependent on CO2, water, and sunlight. When you consider that about 85% of the Earth's surface not covered by ice has some sort of vegetation, and the area covered by all greenery on Earth is about a third, there is a significant amount of land available. Each year, about half of the 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere from industrial production and other human activities is temporarily stored in this. Normally, it's divided between the plants and the oceans, where the oceans become acidic, but plants grow more. This is one reason why the Amazonian rainforest fires of late are a concern. Chemically, the molecules carbon dioxide and oxygen are very similar. There is a key underlying mechanism that takes that carbon dioxide and then turns it into useful material. This is an enzyme with the name Rubisco. The problem with Rubisco is that the similarity of oxygen and carbon dioxide can confuse it. Fortunately, over the roughly 30 million years ago, plants began to recognize this fact and adapt. Unfortunately, plants did not adapt well, and the Rubisco enzyme began to absorb oxygen, which it can use, just not as effectively. This creates a drain upon a plant's energy sources and the resources available to it, leading to less development and growth. As you know with most enzymes, the hotter they get away from their ideal temperature, the less effectively they work as they become denatured. Rubisco has this problem at anything above 25 degrees centigrade, and when it gets to this point, you combine the error-prone Rubisco with an increased dehydration of plants when they dry out. This leads to CO2 not getting into the plant, and it becomes starved of its primary source of fuel. This means it spends more time producing O2 that it then has to break down into single oxygen molecules to put through the Kelvin cycle. This means overall, a plant can use up to 1/4 of the oxygen it produces just to stay alive as temperatures rise. The interesting thing here is that not all plants have the Rubisco enzyme. This is almost like a turbocharger for plants, and many of our perennial crops do have it. These are known as your C4 plants. Plants that do not have it are known as C3 plants. As examples, corn and sugarcane are C4 plants, but wheat, rye, and barley are not. This means that in most cases, many countries will not notice the effect of rising CO2 and global temperatures. So far, so good. Unfortunately, plants demonstrate the law of diminishing returns as CO2 increases. The increasing CO2 leads to less improved growth after a point. The problem is compounded by the effect it has on the nutrition of food. Food crops lose significant amounts of iron and zinc, and for grains, protein, when they are exposed to more CO2 to increase their growth. This is because you are increasing the fundamental size of the plant, but not necessarily the content of certain macro and micronutrients. This leads to the same amount being spread over a larger area, which decreases the concentration. This, in conjunction with the earlier mentioned C3 and C4 plants, means that you have plants that either gain nothing as their CO2 increases, or it is regulated. In the case of C3 plants, they can, to a certain degree, use this extra availability of carbon dioxide. Some science papers report that one particular project running over the last 20 years comparing C3 and C4 plants is not what you would think based on what has been said. For the first 10 years, those grasses that have a C3 Rubisco enzyme were able to perform better than their C4 counterparts. After that first decade had expired, it seems as though the plants had adapted, and as a result, even when exposed to greater carbon dioxide, the C3 plants were not producing as much biomass as the C4 plants. This seems to indicate one of several possibilities. The first being that those plants, as grown where and when they were, simply depleted the soil of the necessary macro and micronutrients. Alternatively, the plants simply adapted and ceased trying to grow excessively. Or we may not yet know why the plants have behaved in the way they have. To make this simple, as we now know, C3 plants waste a lot more resources as temperatures increase. This is because rather than rely on carbon dioxide, they rely on their own oxygen production. This means that even if for the first decade we were to see a temporary increase in the size and production of plants due to global warming, we would also see a commensurate decrease in their productivity as they relied more heavily on their own oxygen production because global warming had caused their Rubisco enzyme to become malformed. In the case of crops and similar, this is important. For plants growing in the wild, it becomes very complicated as they do not receive, and generally cannot receive, artificial supplementation of things like nitrogen. This creates a fundamental rate-limiting step. There has been documentation that at least as far as nitrogen is concerned, that usage of that and an increase in CO2 results in a reduction of photosynthesis, especially in soil that has low nitrogen. This has an effect on crop yield as it temporarily increases it, and then under the low nitrogen conditions it drops. This means that in most studies that have used an enriched carbon dioxide atmosphere, there is lower increase to the amount of biomass produced when there is poor nutrition. This is important in environments like the Amazonian rainforest, where there is no artificial supplementation. Farmers and other people who specialize in agriculture may be able to use this knowledge to some extent, at least temporarily, to increase yields simply by increasing the amount of nitrogen in their fertilizer if the environment is carbon dioxide enriched. But without that, their crops would neither grow as well nor be as nutritious. To quote one Dr. Philippe Caius, who is a director of the Laboratory of Climate and Environmental Sciences of Gif-Souviet, France, plants acclimatize or adjust to rising carbon dioxide concentrations, and even with fertilization, the effect diminishes over time. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.